It's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Since we mention it's free.
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
So tonight, we're very happy to be talking about pyrotechnics. This time of year, it's a great subject for us to know more about. And before we start, I was told by my Science Cafe vigilant team that Nashua has a fireworks law. It's ordinance number 0-08-07, if you're interested. And Nashua is one of the cities in New Hampshire to ban consumer use of fireworks. So we're not encouraging the use of fireworks in Nashua. So tonight we have two panelists. We have Matt Shea, who's from Atlas Pyrotechnics out in Jaffrey. They are one of the biggest firework companies in the country. He says top 10, so that's pretty big. And then we have Nicole Sawyer, who's a psychologist, and she has spent a lot of time working with veterans in the world of PTSD and TBI, and that's a part of the fireworks discussion that we can also delve into. So with that, I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a little more detail, and I'll start with Nicole.
Hi, so I'm Nicole Sawyer. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in Exeter and serve most of the state, however, because I treat veterans, combat veterans, law enforcement, fire, and EMS. That's my primary population. I am the vice chair of the state's commission on PTSD and TBI, which is aimed at improving healthcare access and treatment options for veterans in New Hampshire. So I come at this fireworks discussion from sort of a social emotional perspective on how this time of year, particularly as the summer comes and Memorial Day passes through and the fireworks start going off in our great state of New Hampshire, how it affects the folks living in the communities and where those fireworks are being lit off. Pros and cons. This is not, I don't come at it from a negative angle, but it definitely impacts the work that I do this time of year in particular.
My name is Matt Shea. I'm with Atlas Fireworks, as he had mentioned, and we're both a display fireworks company producing the majority of our shows in New England and then some larger ones around the world. And we also have a consumer line in consumer stores in New Hampshire. So it's two sides of the coin. Like he had said, basically what, the display fireworks part is interesting because we're a production. We do fireworks, pyrotechnics, sometimes smoke effects that are CO2, work with theaters, sports teams, municipalities. If you're getting married, sometimes people have a fireworks display. And then on the retail side is basically working to, we sell the fireworks to consumers. They're different because they're designed for consumer use. And of course, municipalities have different regulations. Most cities usually say no for the obvious reason of the fact that you usually don't have a lot of room in the cities. But we still, we flip over to, for example, in Nashua, we produce the show here in Nashua, which is on the 4th of July. I was invited here to sort of, questions and answers, and also discussing with you guys how fireworks work. When I came in tonight, I brought my prop that I use for some science departments and different things, and the young lady over there, she says, "Hey, this is really cool." And it is, because it's something that you usually don't see. Absolutely. Something you don't usually see, but everybody wants to know what's in the box. And in this particular case, that's what it is. And a little later on, I'll explain what that is and how it works.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and we will bring you a microphone, either Rick or myself. We'll start with that gentleman.
Regarding the fireworks difference between consumer sales and out in the display versions that you have, what would be the differences between them?
Going inside what's in a fireworks shell and what have you chemically, there are chemicals that are banned, that are bad for the environment, bad for people. And so there are just simply chemicals that cannot be used. lead being one of them, which used to make, for anybody in this room that remembers back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, really beautiful blue shells. Well, it was the lead, but unfortunately you can't do that anymore. So now they use, different other compounds, mixes of coppers and whatever to try to get your blues and different things like that. Interestingly enough, traveling to China and going to manufacturers and facilities that make both consumer and display fireworks, the interesting part is because of the tolerances of the types of chemicals that need to be used in consumer fireworks, the fireworks actually turn out in some ways better. I have noticed the colors can be a little bit better, and the performance can be. When you really think about the amount of pyrotechnic composition that is inside a consumer fireworks device, and then you shoot it off and you go, wow. It's regulated by the CPSC. It's inspected. There are random inspections that are taking place in China. And how it works is that you cannot have more than 500 grams of pyrotechnic composition, so basically black powder, in the entire device. So based on those regulations and some practicality testing, both for the retail store but also for the consumer, these retail fireworks, we call them Class C. The new category is 1.4, but everybody still calls them Class C. And Class C is not just for consumer; it's the amount of pyrotechnic composition that's in the device. So, for example, special effects in a theater or at Gillette Stadium when you see things going off, or even tonight, those are still 1.4. But consumer steps it into. It can be used and is permitted by federal law for a consumer to use these fireworks. And a couple of key things is that it has to be assembled. It has to have a warning on it. It basically tells you that it's a dangerous item and to be careful. If anybody's ever used them before, the green Visco fuse, cannon fuse, has to be a minimum of 6 seconds. For the store end, there actually has to be a funny little piece to that. There has to be a piece of flame retardant tape over the fuse. And that actually is so that somebody cannot accidentally ignite it in the store. Law requires a certain level of what the fireworks are, which is basically consumer fireworks. And then it's up to the states to whether they want to adopt an open consumer, which means it matches the federal law, very similar to guns. If you've got a background check, then you can do this and do that. Or like in Massachusetts, it's a banned item. Or in Connecticut, it's a safe and sane state, which means fountains, sparklers are allowed, but anything that is aerial is not. So in New Hampshire here, they go straight by the federal guidelines. It's not how it started. It started with us actually having a few restricted items, firecrackers, bottle rockets, and different things like that. In Maine, they actually banned the little spiral wheels that go up, the sunflowers. A lot of our baseball park games, we actually use consumer fireworks. And there's one reason, which actually brings into Nicole this, and then I'll let it go to the next person, is because baseball parks, Fisher Cats particularly, they really like to have fireworks. It's a key, important part of their game presentation. However, if I was shooting display fireworks that are bigger and louder, what ends up happening is that people get upset. People who have to work at night, work in the next morning, they're trying to sleep. Veterans, dogs, horses. And so by using the consumer, the noise doesn't travel as far. It's a better display for the client. And everyone is really, a lot happier with that product being, produced.
I keep hearing about fireworks displays inside in a building, and I'm in awe that you can blow any of this sort of stuff out in the building. You've touched on it because you kept using the term inside, but tell me how you can have these things inside and ventilate the place well enough that you don't kill everybody.
People come to me and go, "Hey, you go to China for fireworks?" Yes, we do. That's where fireworks were invented. No, they weren't. Black powder was invented in China. And what happened is that it wasn't until the Europeans, and remember, for anybody that took history, the alchemists that were employed by the kings and the feudal landowners, they would have their own alchemists to try to make gold, try to make beer, though the monks did a better job with that. But they would do parties, and their parties were not fireworks like you traditionally see. They actually resembled more of what you see indoors. And they were, they didn't have in the beginning, they didn't have colors. It wasn't until they created them, worked with metal salts and came up with a way that they could actually put into these stars that are here, they could put in something that burns and makes colors. But your question is a very common question that I get, particularly when I'm producing a special effects show in a community that has never had one. There are some theaters that I do a lot of work. If anybody's ever seen like Christmas Carol in North Shore Music Theater, which is a lot of students go there, I do produce the pyro for that during some of those key elements. And that pyrotechnics, and even the stuff that we use at Gillette, which even though it's indoors, and we call it stadium pyro, or outdoors, but we call it stadium pyro, the only difference is it doesn't have a height requirement. So when I do things indoors, Monarchs is one, the theater, or even, at the Celtics games, Bruins, rock concerts, they have a height limit, and they're tested in a building that's like a silo with the proper atmospheric pressure so that they can get that height correctly. And these little devices are very, very small. They're almost like wafers, and they burn quickly. They use chemicals that, they are held to a little bit of a higher degree with some of the chemicals, but they need to do that anyways because they need this device to be reliable. And so there's a lot of theatrical and indoor pyrotechnics that happen. We have to do it safely. To mimic a fireworks effect, we actually hang it from the ceiling. So it's hung on a wire, and then that fireworks effect actually has a certain rating. It's the diameter of the effect, and you can get down at 10 feet with these devices. So it's a great question, and it's a question that is always brought up to me, particularly, as I said, when people have special effects show that's happening. Sometimes I did one where the owner of a paper distribution company wanted to. It was his daughter went to school there. His children went to school there, and they did a play. It was called the Inley School. And he funded the entire Wizard of Oz play and wanted it to be done just as it would be done in say, Boston. And one of those was we did, pyrotechnics, and it was something new. And, of course, I had children on stage because one thing that's interesting is the audience has to be 15 feet away from the pyrotechnics, minimum. However, performers are considered not part of the audience, and so performers can be standing right there, which is why we their clothing is flame retardant.
The loud booms and everything, is that built into the display, or are those two separate things? And if you could, is it possible to create a silent display?
There's two parts to that answer. Part one is that the fireworks shell needs to have a lot of energy released at one time. It's actually a low explosive, and so it needs to be able to light. It lights quickly. It's actually more dangerous than dynamite because it's easier to actually ignite it. But it needs to create that chain reaction, but at the same time, it needs to stay hot enough to light these. However, when you see on the internet the ones that are no noise or low noise, What they really do is they just dump out. So there's still a burst charge, but what it does is it just sort of dumps out of the shell. Waterfall shells, which I had made reference to before, they're one of the quietest shells. Why? Because they actually need to dump and then just go. There's another one called, it's called Cartita in Spain. It's also known as falling leaves. They use little matchbooks and they coat them with a black powder on them, or now they use plastic sometimes, depending on where they are, and they float. Those also can break softly. But your traditional peony and chrysanthemum shells and all of those are your two base shells that everything starts from there. So you have your dahlias, your peonies, and your chrysanthemums, and those are the infancy of what any kind of fireworks shell is. Those need to have that. However, I'll give you an example in Durham, New Hampshire. We do a fireworks display now for the town that is right next to horse stables across the street at UNH. And so we've had to take proper, measures to make sure that they don't have issues, because the horses will get scared. And they'll either hurt their handlers or they'll hurt themselves. So a couple of things they do is, one is you turn the lights on, turn music on, shut all the doors. That helps them. The other thing we don't do, which is part two of what you had asked, is that we are not putting in the salutes, which are at the very end of the show. So salutes are made with flash powder, which is an aluminum composition. It's also it's very volatile. You could, in theory, drop a salute and it will detonate if it has enough of an impact. By confining it into a shell, it wants to get out, and so it actually makes a really loud noise. So we remove that element out of there. Artillery shells we would remove, so that basically you still have, shells with a bang, but you don't have the ferocity of that like you do with salutes.
I'll throw the question out to both of you guys on this one. It's sort of a two-part question. When it comes to firework design, are there certain aspects, like studies that say red sort of evokes a certain emotion versus blue colors or things like that? So is there anything in terms of how you pick what colors and things go in that affect people emotionally? And then I guess question number two is, or the second half of that would be, do you guys have an R&D department that we're still trying to get a certain turquoise green color that we'd love to get out? We're testing all these different types of metals to get that, to find that right type of color that we want.
We don't manufacture our fireworks. Domestic manufacturing with fireworks is basically almost non-existent, except for with indoor pyrotechnics. In China, they work very hard to make the best colors that they can possibly do. They're limited on some of their raw materials. They're limited with some of the quality of their raw materials. We import from Spain and Italy for some of the better colors where they have access to better raw materials, even to the degree of charcoal. For example, in China, they have a limited resource of wood. And though they're trying to grow trees like crazy now, it's not the quality that makes good charcoal. But it makes, it's good. It's just not what we need. In Europe, they actually use olive trees and grapevines, which is actually what China's starting to do, because China's been really trying to get into the wine market. So now they're buying all of these. If anybody's ever been to a winery in the fall, there are these baskets that you can buy that are made to burn of all of the vines of what they cut, because you cut the plant back. So they use that. R&D takes place when Steve and I go to China, or I had to go to Barcelona a couple of months ago to just check some different things out for some shows that we're doing. And the colors are fantastic, the way they do them. That's really what we look for. As far as emotions are concerned, everything that we do plays into the emotional part. You see it more in some of the high-level shows that we design to music. where I need to be able to capture a certain piece, an element, and bring it and allow people to actually feel the music through the fireworks. Not necessarily always done with colors, but particularly patterns, waterfall patterns, for example, heart patterns, smile patterns. So we try to do it with that way, and you really see it when it needs to be exploited by the music that goes in and works with it as well.
So that's a really great question from a trauma perspective. Color is probably the least impactful piece of the fireworks on folks who are responding negatively to the fireworks display. It is typically the smell, the sound, those two things in particular, as well as sort of the chest thumping experience of like the big booms. The color has some impact, but the colors almost throw off the impact, the effect of it being perceived to be a threat in some way, because very little of what was experienced in a war zone situation is lime green, going through the sky. So honestly, it's more about the smell, the sudden nature of the explosion, the chest thumping, and the noise. Those are the primary factors that have the most impact. Dan is handing out right now a flyer that gets distributed this time of year that is specific to why 4th of July fireworks or fireworks in general are difficult for combat veterans, for many combat veterans, not all. I don't want to overgeneralize, but for some combat veterans, and it speaks a little bit to some of these issues of the sudden startle is really a big factor, and when that sudden startle is accompanied is caused by a sound that at one time in their life may have indicated a significant threat to life. It sets off a whole line of emotions that get chained together. And for folks who are struggling with post-traumatic symptoms, it can be very difficult to recover from that.
Obviously, the fireworks have a lot of engineering involved in them. And one thing I think is really interesting, particularly about indoor fireworks when they're in the air, particularly not just pyrotechnics, is how you keep debris from raining down on people watching fireworks. So like you don't really see pieces of charred shell around, so they dissipate fairly quickly. So I was wondering if you could speak a minute about the engineering of how these work.
You've all seen this, and you can see that it has a lot of paper mache, cardboard, all of this burns. But in my early days, I used to we produced Washington, D.C., and the specs for that one was that everything had to go above the Washington Monument so that everybody who could see the Washington Monument could see the fireworks display. Well, that meant really big shells. Okay. And it also meant this is called the burst charge in the middle of it. And what this is made of is rice hulls that are coated with black powder. And that way it keeps them all fluffy and it makes it a nice, even break. Well, we had so many rice hulls that after the show the next morning, all you saw were rice hulls all over the place. However, indoor fireworks or pyrotechnics are different. And you can buy two types depending on your application. So, for example, when we hang the ones that resemble fireworks shell, it's actually in a piece of saran wrap.
You already pulled that one on.
And so nothing actually comes back down. For the comets and mines that we use, which is basically the things you see a streak of light, a comet is, for all intents and purposes, a comet would be one of these that's shot out of a tube. Well, it burns and there's nothing else. It doesn't break. And now they're making them with their zero debris. And they're even starting to make them smokeless using nitrocellulose powder. So basically, there's no cardboard pressure caps. There's no foil over them. So there's really no debris.
If there's certain chemicals that give certain colors to the displays that we see, what's the either chemistry or engineering that gets shapes like a heart to how to get them to pattern out like that without giving away proprietary knowledge?
A heart pattern is actually really basic. It needs to do two things. It needs to look like a heart, And it also needs to break very hard because these stars, which is what we call them, they need to get out there as fast as possible before they light. So the first thing is that if you were to look at a heart pattern, what you would see is the round stars that are on the top of the shell and going around would be in the shape of a heart. But what you also would see is that this burst charge would be very large. And the stars are what they are is they break dark. And what that means is that you know those Christmas cookies, the little rum balls, the chocolate ones, and you coat them with some cocoa so when you get them, they're like a chocolate little thing. You can make them, and then you coat them with the cocoa. Well, it's the same idea, only it's with just black powder, and it's a very powdery. So what happens is that it lights and it goes and travels through the sky dark, so that you don't see colors, you don't see light, you don't see anything else. And then when it hits the strontium mix, if it's red, there you go. Then you get the red. But it has to do that quickly. So believe it or not, some of the loudest shells are actually pattern shells because they need to just get out there as fast as possible.
My question's for Nicole. And hearing about the music and the closing the doors, does that work with the people who have PTSD? And can you give a little bit of background on like you talked about the smell and the sounds as a trigger, but if like I'm thinking of schedules for fireworks. So 4th of July, there's going to be fireworks. How does somebody with PTSD prepare for that versus how does somebody with PTSD deal with if their neighbors just randomly, got a sale at a fireworks company down the street and decided to shoot them all off because it was a really good deal?
In terms of what works for people to cope with it and get through is very individual. It's really, there's no sort of general answer around that. But I will tell you, and part of what's contained in this this handout is that predictability on a fireworks display is hugely beneficial to folks who have PTSD or and PTSD is sometimes an overstatement. People who are feeling triggered by fireworks, they may not have full-blown PTSD. So predictability helps because it allows the person to know ahead of time, okay, around 6 o'clock tonight, my town's going to set off the fireworks. So when I start hearing those booms, I can bring myself back to earth. That initial one's going to startle me, but then I can pull myself back together and realize that this is going to go till probably about 10 o'clock, and then it's going to be over. And then, so coping has a beginning and an end. The difficulty comes, as you pointed out, when the neighborhood displays begin. When on a random Tuesday night, 2 houses down in their cul-de-sac, there's suddenly all these explosions going off, and they didn't know it was going to happen. The difficulty is the trigger sets off a line of emotions and a chemical experience for them that puts them in a state of mind of warrior. So the chemical system that was important for their survival when they were overseas gets triggered when they're sitting in their living room. And that is not a good combination. And it's very uncomfortable. So a person who is self-aware enough to know what's happening for them probably has some coping strategies that they can enact in order to get through. But some folks have a really difficult time pulling themselves back down to earth. They may lose sleep for days. They can't get that pattern of thinking out of their minds. And that's really what the difference is. We all get startled by things from time to time. So if we were all sitting here right now and a server was coming through with a tray full of glasses and dropped it, we would all jump out of our skin for a second, right? But someone who's struggling with PTSD jumps out of their skin and then they stay out of their skin. All of us pause for a second, we see what happened, and then we go back to our conversation, right? For them, they're completely distracted. A chain of events has been set off in their brain. And recovering from that is incredibly difficult. That's what makes the disordered part of post-traumatic stress, is that difficulty of regulating the emotional experience once it's been triggered.
Have you explored other uses for fireworks besides entertainment?
Some form of fireworks are used in military training exercises. That's when you get into that theatrical part to it. But the problem with fireworks is they're actually a very inefficient way of creating an explosion. So their use is really limited to entertainment. You could use it, in 200 years ago before dynamite was invented and, the different types of compounds that they use for the military now. You would use fireworks or you would use the components of fireworks. Most commonly would be a cannonball. It was used militarily, but it wasn't very good. They compared to what they have today, it's a low explosive, and as people would know that are chemists or in the military, the lower the burn temperature, the ignition temperature, the less energy it takes, which means the less energy that's in there. And when I say about the dynamite being safer than fireworks, is if I was smoking a cigarette and I was working near fireworks, I could, especially with these, because they're not meant for consumers, I could accidentally light this. I've had guys who blast for a living that I had to tell them to please don't smoke around the fireworks because they're so used to doing it. Because in blasting, it takes a small explosion to create a bigger explosion till they finally, what actually does all of the work is basically pelletized diesel fuel. And even that's changed now.
Back on the heart pattern, to give an example, when I've seen it, I've almost never been in the wrong position. I've never seen one edge on. I assume, though, that they aren't 3D. They don't look 3D whenever I see them. Maybe they're a little compressed, but is it just that the position of the folks putting on the display is always such that kind of the crowd is in front of them, not all around them? So the heart can always be more or less facing the audience?
Typically, you don't always see a heart pattern for the very reason why he said. Heart patterns are one-dimensional or two-dimensional. And so I'll give you an example. When he sees the good heart pattern, you don't. There have been attempts over the years, the Japanese are more successful at it, of creating, weights and things inside the shell that orient it so that it's seen. The better idea is to just shoot a bunch of them in sequence so that he sees this one, then the next one, you see it. And then, those things on Facebook that you get to see and somebody puts it and goes, oh, wow, that's a this. And everybody goes, that's because the human brain is wonderful. Because the heart pattern, the smile pattern, the peace pattern, the star pattern can all be upside down. Yet your brain has the exact same emotion. And I probably bet that half the time they were sideways and upside down and nobody ever noticed the difference. That's on the psychology part of it, of how the brain works. But particularly with smile patterns, I'm just happy if it's facing you. I don't care if it's upside down. So it's a really difficult part. We've had some shells where they've had, there are ghost patterns, which means that they've actually, remember we talked about the chocolate balls that are covered with the powder? What they do is they actually create ghost rings so you don't see them and then they reappear. And they're really cool. And they're like multiple rings and they spiral and they do different things. Those are a little bit more on the three-dimensional level and you can see it no matter where it is. But when you get to your smile patterns, heart patterns, and different pattern shells like that, they're really usually seen by whoever they're facing. And just to continue with that, only to sort of accelerate my time, because this question always comes up, where people will go, hey, can we do letters? Can we do this? Letters don't really work very well for the same reasons. But now what you're going to start seeing that's new is that we actually you've seen it in the Olympics, and it's been perfected more, is that we take these mines and we take a whole bunch of them and they're actually in a pattern box, so they're positioned like a 10 or a W or an A or a B, and they're shot at you, and they're a ghost pattern to begin with, and then right at their apex, they are visible, and you actually see that. And that's really the only way we're actually able to successfully do letter patterns.
How did you get into this business? I mean, did you grow up wanting to blow things up, or, I mean, did you were you trained by somebody? Who trains those that want to get into the business? Are you a certifier, or who certifies you? Are there rank amateurs out there just trying to get into your business?
Our industry is very interesting because we're all small companies. Even the largest fireworks display companies are still small businesses. And we rely on hobbyists that get paid to produce our fireworks shows. So when it's a good economy like now, it's a little bit harder. When it's a bad economy, I know before anybody does, because the guys that just lost their overtime but still have the payment on the Harley Davidson, they come to me and, hey, can I drive? Can I produce fireworks and shoot and work with a crew? And a crew is a lead technician that's licensed and his friends. And if they're not friends, they become friends. All of those friends have to get a background check through the ATF. They have to go to our hazardous awareness training, which is very similar to a lot of companies nowadays that you may work for or even go, where there's a one-day training and they're talking about, all the different hazards that are in your facility, even if it's not a hazardous facility. So we rely on people who really like fireworks to do the fireworks displays. We have 580-ish part-time employees. A good percentage of them shoot over the 10 days of the 4th of July, maybe 1 or 2 shows over the summer. Then we have another percentage of them that shoot just in the summer. And then we have about 25% of those employees all year round, any show I give them. And the crews are different. I use different types of crews for some of our stadium events where they have to think differently, and they can't be afraid of heights. So and that's sometimes a way I get people into it. I go, hey, do you want to go to a Patriots game? We leave Jaffrey at 6 in the morning. And they're like, what do you mean we leave at 6 in the morning? The game doesn't start till 4. I said, yeah, but you're not afraid of heights, are you? And, no, okay, well, because we'll check on that one. And it's amazing how many people go, I'm not afraid of heights, and then they get up on the light ring, and then they go, hey, this moves. It's like, well, if it didn't move, it would break. And then what happens is that you go, hey, you liked it? It was great. It was fun. Good. Do you like fireworks? And we go from there. So a lot of times, my new crews and my new people are people who I'm trying to get involved in the business, and I have to bait them with a game, which is how I got involved. So I liked fireworks as a kid. It was interesting because I understood and learned about the trauma of fireworks as we would watch every 4th of July, the fireworks display in Revere at the time was behind my grandparents' house. And everybody would be on the roof with buckets of water because then tolerances were much different. And you would have burning debris that would land on the roof, or maybe part of the shell would land on the roof with, the rest of it not going off. One day I went out and I found the old way they made fireworks shells, there was actually some sawdust in them. And there was a canister that had come back down that had, had some sawdust on it. I left it there. Now we do first light searches to make sure that doesn't happen. I actually got into the fireworks sort of, for lack of a better word, because we're in a bar, but ass backwards. So I had a musical part to things, and I did music editing and different things of that nature when I wasn't selling and doing promotions and all sorts of other fun stuff. And of course, anytime I had a promotion, I also included a fireworks display. So my early parts of selling fireworks actually started even earlier than anything else. But because of the technical part with radios and communications, I actually started getting involved in the higher end, going there and working on these shows as more of a technical liaison for sound transmission, and everything else. Then I started doing fireworks shows. My first one was 1996, New Year's Eve up in Bretton Woods, and it was 27 degrees below zero. But in the earlier days, Steve and I would go to the old Patriot Stadium, and it was great because it was so much easier. We'd shoot right in there. He had a van, and we became friends because that's what happens. You're doing all of these things, and you're becoming friends. That's how I got in the business. It's just as the radio business started getting a little bit weirder, and I was literally doing both. I was shooting fireworks shows, which is what my part-time people do now. I was leaving for Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks. I was just doing these shows on weekends. And Steve would ask me on some of the earlier clients that had more needs technically, that I would work with them. So I actually started working with clients that, while I was at the station. And I just felt it was my time to move over full time. Him and I, we sort of moved the business into more of a production end, and it's a stem to stern complete production. And 25 years later, I've been practically everywhere in New England. I've been at every event, major and minor, that I could possibly think of. If there's an anniversary of a bridge I've just done some amazing things, which is great. I've been to some places I would have never been to, one being China. Manila, Da Nang, where else? Everywhere. Montreal is, those are places you may go to, but it was different because I also get to work with the people. And so you're not only there as a tourist, but you're there working with people, or you're there as a buyer when you're in China. So it's really been very rewarding. And just like all of my part-time employees, I started that way as well. And slowly but surely, I made my way to where I am today.
I'm curious about your acquisition. So can you talk about where you go to get these things? And the other second half of my question is innovation. How does innovation happen? Do you go to a show and somebody says, "Oh, we got the coolest new thing, watch this"? Or how does that happen in pyrotechnics?
I always like to make the connection between pyrotechnics and cooking, and baking, fireworks. It's very similar. If you were to go to a manufacturing facility, you would see a lot of the same utensils that are used. They're all stainless steel, and they're doing it outdoors, and the colors are always black. But when you think about it, the way they make the balls, the way they make everything, they're really sort of making, even the way they design with the chemicals, they're really, depending on where you go and what part of the world you go to, and where you're in China, what manufacturer you're at, and who will say the baker is, who designed it. You're going to get different colors, and over the years, you get to know that as you're getting your relationships together. So keeping in mind that making fireworks is like baking. Having a fireworks display company is like having a traveling restaurant. Just like in a restaurant, you go there and you can go down the street and everybody's buffalo chicken all kind of taste a little bit better. The wings may be done better. The sauce is better. But you want to go into a restaurant and sometimes you sit down and you're like, wow, this is new and this is different. And then, that's sort of where you try to add that into your repertoire. What we do is, as we're buying, and it's a year-long process, we're constantly importing containers in throughout the year. And we go to these factories. We also look at what we've done over the past 2 or 3 years bringing in our inventory. You know, one year we may bring in more golder colors with red pistils and different things of that nature. The next year we may bring in more scattering shells. We may bring in this or that or different types of shells depending on just what we've also done so that they look different, so that it's sort of like we're holding back what we could use for another year, and then we rotate that effect, not for any reason other than to keep the variety in the fireworks display. However, like I explained, you know, we're producing a show in Montreal. It's a world competition that we've been invited to this year, which tasks us differently. So think of it as the restaurant gets to go on one of those food channels and they have to feature themselves. Then they win the competition, or just because they're in that competition, they start introducing that in their restaurant. It's the same thing. So when I went to Barcelona and Steve went to Italy this year, we were looking for different things, different colors, sort of different, unique, more European style effects. You know, we purchased them, and those will be peppered in some of our higher end client shows because they're also much more money. We continue with our regular Chinese suppliers who are getting better at just making better colors. And just by keeping that fresh and sort of continuing it, it's really like running a restaurant, and you're just dealing with different ways of baking and cooking and what have you.
Can you give us an idea of how much, and I know there's probably no typical show based on what you've been saying, but let's say an average show, a municipal show, how much would something like that cost?
It's an easier question than you would think. So for like weddings and private shows, your average price is somewhere around $5,000. However, I've also done private shows that were $130,000. It was a Walmart granddaughter in Columbia, Missouri. And believe it or not, we were probably the smallest line item in that deal. The municipal shows, you know, they typically run the ones that are like the cities around here are typically 25 to 30,000, and that's pretty much straightforward, straight across throughout New England. And then your old home days and your off the 4th of July smaller municipal shows range from 7,500 to 15,000. And then, you know, when you get to your private events, you know, I can't quote you on, you know, what like the Patriots spend or some of these other ones, but you know, your college team still, you know, your division, your upper division, I think it's Division I, teams that are around here because they've been tasked with creating a better presentation. They'll spend anywhere from, you know, $8,000 to $15,000 for just the game, which isn't even fireworks.
Okay, so let's thank Matt for his time and for being here. We have a few questions for Nicole out there.
You had mentioned earlier that there are obviously different triggers for PTSD episodes based on each person and each person's experiences. Is there a standard therapy or way of treating folks? Is there a base where you start and then add or subtract from?
PTSD, particularly in the military population and more recently among the first responder population, is sort of a hot topic in terms of trying to find that treatment, right? The treatment that's going to fix people. And understandably so. I mean, people want to get better, and this is really, you know, it's a terrible state to be in. But the reality is that each person it's a very, very individual experience of what PTSD even means to them, what sort of impact it has on their life, what kind of treatments are going to work for them. Really what they all boil down to is helping the person figure out what it is that is setting off the negative emotions for them. And that's typically what we call a trigger. And some triggers are really obvious, right? Like a big boom that you suddenly didn't expect, right? But other triggers can be, you know, a negative thought pattern that they find themselves stumbling into when they feel tired and hungry. It's sometimes that simple. So what they all boil down to essentially is figuring out how to help a person interfere with the thought patterns that occur that are debilitating to them. Because that is really essentially, for all of us, our thought patterns run our lives, and usually it's happening on a very unconscious level. So somebody who has negative thought patterns that are really interfering with their ability to function in their day-to-day life, to be in healthy relationships, to have a healthy work situation, to feel good about themselves, to take good care of themselves, those negative thought patterns need to be interfered with. Typically, they're very unconscious. And treatment goal is to bring them to the conscious. So to point out, to figure out, to identify what are those negative thought patterns so that we can then address them. So it's really, no matter what the treatment title is called, no matter what sort of, workbook we might be working through or what kind of specialist it might be, what it really comes down to is helping that person bring consciousness to the unconscious thoughts and feelings that they're having that are really negatively impacting their life.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the smell too. I mean, that's really what I love about fireworks so much is the smell. And I guess it's very similar.
That sulfur burning smell is very much quintessential to fireworks or any sort of, for some people, a campfire situation or any kind of burn, right? And for many of us, we have a very positive reaction to that. But that sulfur smell also can be very reminiscent of explosions and mortar rounds. And that obviously has a negative triggering effect for folks who have made the association, right? So that's what it's really all about, is it's an association that's been made now in their brain. For example, if you have a positive memory of a loved one in your life, and maybe that person always took you fishing, or maybe that person always baked you cookies, right? So when you go on a fishing trip and you smell the smell of a small boat's engine, right, a two-stroke engine maybe, or you smell the smell of a fish, you might have a really positive memory of that person, like, oh, I remember when, right? That is the exact same experience for a person who has a negative memory of a smell. Olfactory memories are the strongest memories that our brain contains. And so a smell can trigger something really positive and a smell can trigger something really negative. But we make that association with powerful emotions. If you have a nice positive smell with somebody that you love dearly, it's a very strong association that gets made in your brain. Similarly, if you are experiencing something incredibly negative, like a life-threatening event, and there's a smell associated with it, which there often is, that creates a similar pattern in your brain where that smell is going to trigger that negative event, just like it would have triggered that warm, yummy feeling if you smelled cookies.
For somebody with PTSD, is there a cure? Or is it just a matter of coping for the rest of their life? Is there anything that they can do? And if there isn't, how do they prepare for the upcoming holidays or New Year's or other types of things to kind of help them get through those, the difficult days?
That's a really great question, and it's a question that gets posed frequently in terms of whether or not there's a cure. Post-traumatic stress disorder it's an animal that needs to be tamed, really. It's not something that ever completely goes away. Post-traumatic stress disorder is an experience that has marked you for life, okay? The way that it affects your life is what we're working on. We can't take away a person's experience of trauma. It has become a part of who they are, and they have formed their thoughts and patterns and personality around that experience. To take that away would have change the person completely, and that's really not the aim. The aim is to help that person incorporate those experiences into their life so that they don't interfere with their healthy functioning. So that's what gets tricky about calling PTSD a disorder. It's a disorder because it makes your life disordered in terms of your ability to function. But we have all of us in this room have experienced some level of post-traumatic stress, whether it was a really bad breakup, a divorce, a sudden loss of a loved one, a car accident. We've all had that feeling where we feel sick to our stomach, or we've lost sleep, or we haven't eaten for days, we feel overwhelmed, we can't stop thinking about it, we drive by the street where that accident happened and we find ourselves feeling tearful. That's post-traumatic stress, and we've all had those experiences before. The disorder is when those experiences begin to interfere with your ability to function in the world or to take good care of yourself. So the cure is really just helping the person find a way to incorporate that loss or that trauma into themselves and put it where it belongs. So post-traumatic stress disorder is when something that happened in the past that you had a trauma reaction to stays in the forefront of your mind, and it interferes with everything that you think and do and see. It's like it becomes a lens that you look at the world through. Treatment for that's goal is to find a way to take that lens off, put that experience of trauma, which is real, it had an effect on you, and it has formed who you are in this moment, but put the experience back where it belongs, in our past. So we can recall it if we want to, but we have control over that. Control is essential. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when that person doesn't have any control over how that experience comes into their life and affects them on any given moment. So fireworks, for example, is a situation where a person with post-traumatic stress disorder has a sudden boom occur or smells the smell of the sulfur, and all of a sudden they don't have any control anymore over about the feelings and memories that rush into their life in that moment. And suddenly it interferes with their ability to interact with the people that they're standing around. It interferes with their ability to behave in the way that they want to behave. That's the disorder. So we can't take away from a person the fact that fireworks, for a person who has taken artillery fire, is going to make them jump. It's going to make them have a memory of like, whoa, that didn't feel very good. What we want to help them do is be able to then proceed with that barbecue that they're at with their friends and enjoy themselves. We want them to be able to have that moment of startle, note that it doesn't feel that good and that there's a memory associated with that, but now I can move forward. The disorder is when that person can't move forward.
How many people in Nashua might be at a stage of PTSD where they would be subject to that?
I couldn't even guess. I mean, let's see. Less than 1% of the population serves at any given time in the military, right? And even a smaller percentage of those folks have experienced combat of any kind that they would have noted a life-threatening experience. So numbers-wise, very, very low. However, if you start doing the math over all of the various conflicts that we've been in since about World War II, which are the folks that are sort of left alive, you know, the numbers can add up. But, you know, just to really quick point out that it's not, I've been talking a lot about combat veterans because that's a very clear and distinct association between an explosion and an experience of a combat veteran. Sudden startles in general are a difficult thing for anybody who experiences PTSD. So you could have a person who has long-term childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence victims. Those folks as well have a tremendous startle response often that is associated with the disorder. So a startle response, as I said before, with the server carrying the tray that suddenly drops, right? So whether you have experience with explosions or you simply have an experience that causes a startle trigger for you, both of those reactions are going to send you through the roof, and it's going to make you very difficult for you to come down. So yes, combat veterans are frequently an easy sort of identifier for someone who would struggle with this stuff, but sudden startles are a difficult thing for anybody to cope with who has struggled with PTSD or any kind of trauma.
All right, well, let's give Nicole a hand.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming to this abbreviated session. We do have a beaker on the way out if you want to drop $1 or $2 to help us keep this operation going. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you next month.